The morning mist hung low over Ouagadougou as the sun began its ascent into the African sky. The air carried the familiar sounds of a city awakening, distant calls of street vendors, the rumble of motorcycles, and the gentle hum of everyday life beginning anew. President Ibrahim Traoré sat in the back seat of his armored vehicle, reviewing briefing papers as his convoy navigated through the capital's busy streets. The security meeting had run longer than expected. 3 hours of discussing border tensions, economic challenges, and the ever-present threat of insurgency had left him mentally drained. His advisors had presented him with countless documents, each requiring his immediate attention and signature. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on his shoulders as he contemplated the day ahead. Another public event, more speeches, more promises to a nation that desperately needed hope. "Sir, we'll reach the venue in 15 minutes, his driver, Captain Ouedraogo, announced through the intercom. President Ibrahim nodded absently, then suddenly looked up from his papers. Something stirred within him, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. "Take the old cemetery road," he said quietly. The head of security, Colonel Sawadogo, immediately turned around. "Mr. President, that route wasn't cleared by our advance team. It's not on today's security protocol." "I understand," Ibrahim replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had helped him navigate the complex world of West African politics. "But today, we go through the cemetery road." His security detail exchanged worried glances, but knew better than to argue further. The convoy adjusted its route, turning down the narrow road that wound past Ouagadougou's oldest cemetery. The ancient, baobab trees cast long shadows across the weathered tombstones, creating a tapestry of light and darkness that seemed to whisper stories of generations past. As they drove slowly through this sacred space, President Ibrahim found himself studying the landscape through his bulletproof window. The cemetery was a place where rich and poor lay side by side, where earthly differences meant nothing. It was here, among these silent witnesses to human mortality, that he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old, sitting cross-legged, beside a modest grave. Her clothes were little more than rags, a faded yellow dress with holes at the knees and sleeves that had long since lost their original color. Her small feet were bare and dusty, and her hair was matted and uncombed. But it was her posture that caught his attention first, the way she sat with such dignity despite her obvious poverty, the careful way she moved her hands as she cleaned the headstone with a torn piece of cloth. "Stop the car!" President Ibrahim commanded. The convoy came to an immediate halt. Colonel Sawadogo's hand instinctively moved to his weapon. "Sir, this area hasn't been secured. We don't know who else might be watching." "I said stop the car," Ibrahim repeated, his tone brooking no argument. As the presidential vehicle's engine fell silent, the only sounds were the distant calls of mourning doves and the gentle rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. President Ibrahim opened his door and stepped onto the dusty path, his polished shoes crunching softly on the gravel. His security detail immediately surrounded him, their eyes scanning every shadow, every potential threat. The little girl hadn't noticed the convoy's arrival. She continued her careful ministrations to the grave, speaking in whispers that were carried away by the wind. As President Ibrahim approached, he could make out fragments of her one-sided conversation. "Mama, the rains came early this year," she was saying, her young voice carrying a maturity that seemed far beyond her years. "The flowers you planted are blooming beautifully. Papa, I've been practicing my letters like you taught me. I can write my name now without any mistakes." President Ibrahim stopped a respectful distance away and cleared his throat gently. The girl looked up, and their eyes met for the first time. In that moment, Ibrahim felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes were the most remarkable he had ever seen, large, dark, and filled with a sadness that no child should ever have to carry. Yet beneath that sadness was something else. Courage, intelligence, and an unbreakable spirit that seemed to shine from within. "Good morning," he said softly, crouching down to her level. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." The girl studied him for a moment, taking in his fine clothes and the serious-looking men who stood guard around him. "You're the president," she said. Simply as if stating an obvious fact, Ibrahim was surprised. "How do you know that?" "Your picture is on the money," she replied, then added with childlike honesty, "though I don't have any money to look at very often." Despite the gravity of the moment, Ibrahim found himself smiling. "What's your name?" "Divine," she answered, returning her attention to the grave. "And these are my parents." President Ibrahim read the names carved into the simple concrete headstone. "Jean-Baptiste Caboret and Marie Caboret taken too soon. To our beloved daughter Divine. Take care of your future, for you carry our dreams with you always." "They died 2 years ago," Divine continued, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to form in her eyes. "There was a fire in our house. They pushed me out the window, but they couldn't get out themselves." The president felt his throat tighten. "Where do you live now?" Divine gestured toward a small makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard and plastic sheets, partially hidden behind a large mausoleum. "Here, with them. It's not much, but at least we're together." "You live here alone?" Ibrahim asked, incredulous. Divine nodded. "At first, my uncle took me in, but his wife said I brought bad luck. She said I was cursed because I survived when my parents didn't. Then my aunt tried to help, but she has 6 children of her own and barely enough food to feed them. So I came back here. At least here. People leave me alone." Colonel Sawadogo shifted uncomfortably behind the president, clearly eager to move on. But Ibrahim was transfixed by this remarkable child who had survived unimaginable loss and somehow maintained her dignity and grace. "What do you eat?" he asked gently. "Sometimes the cemetery caretaker, Mr. Bila, shares his lunch with me. Sometimes people visiting their families give me a few coins or some bread, and sometimes—" She paused, seeming embarrassed. "Sometimes I have to look in the bins behind the bakery." President Ibrahim felt anger rising in his chest, not at Divine, but at a society that could abandon such a precious child. He turned to Colonel Sawadogo. "Call the Minister of Social Affairs immediately. I want a full report on this child's situation within the hour." "Sir, we really should—" the colonel began. "Now," Ibrahim said firmly, then turned back to Divine. "Would you like to come with me today?" Divine looked at him with those remarkable eyes, studying his face as if trying to read his soul. "Why?" "Because no child should live alone in a cemetery. Because you deserve better. Because—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "Because I think you might be exactly who I need in my life right now." Divine was quiet for a long moment, her small hand resting on her parents' gravestone. "Can I visit them?" "Every day, if you want to." "Can I bring them flowers? The most beautiful flowers in all of Burkina Faso." Divine stood up slowly, brushing the dust from her tattered dress. "Okay," she said simply. "But I need to tell them goodbye for now." She knelt beside the grave once more and whispered words that only the wind could hear. Then she stood up, took President Ibrahim's outstretched hand, and walked with him toward the convoy that would change her life forever. The presidential palace rose before Divine like something from a fairy tale. Its white walls gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the manicured gardens were filled with flowers she had only seen in picture books. As the convoy passed through the heavily guarded gates, Divine pressed her face to the window, taking in every detail of this new world. Staff members lined the entrance, their crisp uniforms and formal postures a stark contrast to the informal, chaotic life she had known on the streets. President Ibrahim noticed her wide-eyed amazement and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "This is your home now," he said softly. "You don't have to be afraid." But Divine wasn't afraid. She was overwhelmed. The marble floors reflected her bare feet as they walked through corridors lined with portraits of former leaders. Crystal. Chandeliers cast rainbows on the walls, and everywhere she looked, there were people bustling about with important-looking documents and serious expressions. Mrs. Canazoe, the palace housekeeper, had been hastily summoned to prepare accommodations for their unexpected young guest. A warm, motherly woman in her 50s, she took one look at Divine and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Oh, my dear child," she whispered, kneeling down to Divine's level. "Let's get you cleaned up and fed, shall we?" The bathroom was larger than the entire shelter Divine had called home. As Mrs. Canazoe helped her bathe, Divine marveled at the hot water that flowed endlessly from the golden taps. The soap smelled like flowers, and the towels were softer than anything she had ever felt. "There now," Mrs. Canazoe said, wrapping Divine in a fluffy robe. "Much better. Now let's see about some clothes." The room they had prepared for her was overwhelming in its luxury. A large bed with clean white sheets dominated the space, flanked by wooden furniture that gleamed with polish. But what caught Divine's attention was the small bookshelf in the corner, filled with colorful children's books. "Can I really read these?" she asked, running her fingers along the spines. "They're all yours now," Mrs. Canazoe replied, helping her into a simple but clean dress that actually fit. "The president specifically requested them. That first dinner was a revelation. The dining room could have seated 50 people, but it was set for just 2. The president and Divine. The table was laden with dishes she had never seen before, served on plates that seemed too beautiful to eat from. "This is overwhelming, isn't it?" President Ibrahim said, noticing her hesitation. Divine nodded honestly. "I'm not sure I know how to use all these forks." Ibrahim laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine warmth. "Would you like me to teach you?" As they ate, Divine told him about her life before the fire. Her father had been a mechanic who dreamed of opening his own shop. Her mother had sold vegetables in the market and sung lullabies that could chase away any nightmare. They had been poor but happy, rich in love, if not in material possessions. "They taught me to read," Divine said proudly. "Mama said education was the one thing no one could ever take away from me." "Your parents were wise," Ibrahim replied. "Tomorrow, we'll arrange for you to have proper tutoring. But first, you need rest." That night, as Divine lay in the enormous bed, staring up at the ceiling fan that turned lazily overhead, she whispered a prayer to her parents. "I don't know why this happened, but I promise I won't disappoint you. I'll make you proud." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of new experiences. A tutor was hired, Ms. Ouedraogo, a patient woman who quickly recognized Divine's remarkable intelligence. Despite having missed 2 years of formal schooling, Divine absorbed knowledge like a sponge, catching up on mathematics, literature, and science with astounding speed. But it was her observations of palace life that truly set her apart. While other children might have been content to play in the gardens or watch television, Divine found herself fascinated by the workings of government. She would sit quietly in corners, listening to conversations between ministers and advisors, filing away information with the precision of a trained diplomat. President Ibrahim had initially worried about how Divine would adapt to her new surroundings. But she surprised him daily with her resilience and insight. She was respectful to everyone, from the highest-ranking officials to the kitchen staff, and she had a way of asking questions that made even the most experienced politicians stop and think. It was during her third week at the palace that Divine made the observation that would change everything. President Ibrahim had established a routine of having breakfast with her before his official day began, and she had grown comfortable enough to share her thoughts and questions about everything she witnessed. "Papa," she said one morning, using the title that had come naturally to both of them, "I've noticed something about your work." Ibrahim looked up from his morning briefing. "Oh? What's that?" Divine hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "You sign a lot of papers without reading them." The president paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "What makes you say that?" "Yesterday, I was doing my homework in the corner of your office when Mr. Gerard brought in those big folders. You were typing on your computer, and you just signed each page without looking at them. It took maybe 2 minutes for 20 papers." Ibrahim felt a slight flush of embarrassment. "Well, you see, Divine, when you're president, you have to trust the people who work for you. Mr. Gerard has been my personal assistant for 3 years. He checks everything before it comes to me." Divine nodded thoughtfully. "But what if he makes a mistake, or what if someone tricks him?" "That's not likely to happen," Ibrahim said, but even as the words left his mouth, he realized how naive they sounded. "My papa always said that signing your name to something means you agree with everything written on that paper," Divine continued. "He said even if you trust someone completely, you should always know what you're agreeing to." The conversation stayed with Ibrahim throughout the day. During meetings, he found himself thinking about Divine's innocent but pointed questions. During lunch with his cabinet, he wondered how many of these men had ever questioned his signing practices. During his afternoon appointments, he realized that Divine's outsider's perspective might be seeing something that everyone else had grown too comfortable to notice. That evening, he made a decision that would expose a web of corruption that reached deep into his administration. The next morning, when Mr. Gerard arrived with his usual stack of documents, President Ibrahim did something he hadn't done in months. He actually looked at what he was being asked to sign. "Let's go through these together today, Gerard," he said, settling back in his chair. Gerard blinked in surprise. "Sir, all of them? That might take quite a while." "I have time," Ibrahim replied, noting the slight nervousness in his assistant's voice. As they worked through the documents, most seemed routine. Budget allocations, personnel appointments, standard administrative matters. But then Ibrahim came to a document that made him pause. "This transfer of 3 billion CFA francs," he said slowly. "Can you explain this to me?" Gerard shifted in his seat. "It's for the new rural development project, sir. The one we discussed last month." Ibrahim frowned. "I don't recall discussing any rural development project worth 3 billion francs. And this company?" He studied the letterhead. "Sahel Construction Enterprises. I've never heard of them." "They're a new firm, sir. Very reputable. I've done all the background checks." "And this authorization signature from Minister Traoré, when did he sign this?" Gerard's face had begun to perspire. "Last week, I believe." Ibrahim picked up his phone and dialed the finance minister's direct line. "Traoré? Yes, it's Ibrahim. I have a document here with your signature authorizing 3 billion francs for a rural development project. Can you tell me about it?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. President, I haven't signed any such authorization. In fact, I haven't seen any rural development proposals this month." Ibrahim's blood ran cold. He thanked the minister and hung up, his eyes never leaving Gerard's face. "The finance minister says he never signed this document." "There must be some confusion," Gerard began. "Call Minister Traoré and ask him to come here immediately," Ibrahim instructed his secretary through the intercom. Then he turned back to Gerard. "We're going to wait right here until he arrives." The next hour was one of the longest of Gerard's life. When the finance minister arrived and confirmed that he had never seen the document and that his signature was forged, the truth became undeniable. Ibrahim ordered an immediate forensic examination of all documents Gerard had processed in the past 3 months. The investigation revealed a systematic pattern of fraud. Gerard had been working with a network of accomplices to create false documents authorizing transfers to bogus companies. Over the course of 8 months, they had stolen nearly 20 billion CFA francs, money meant for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects that would have improved the lives of millions of Burkinabe citizens. That evening, as Gerard was led away in handcuffs, President Ibrahim sat in his office with Divine, who was quietly working on her mathematics homework in the corner. "You saved our country a lot of money today," he told her. Divine looked up from her books. "I just asked a question, Papa. You did all the hard work." "Sometimes the most important questions come from the most unexpected places," Ibrahim replied, marveling at the wisdom that seemed to flow so naturally from this remarkable child. The news of Gerard's arrest and the corruption scandal sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso. Citizens who had long complained about delayed projects and missing funds finally understood why their country's development had been hampered. The press hailed President Ibrahim's decisive action, but they were even more intrigued by reports that a young girl had played a role in exposing the fraud. A week after Gerard's arrest, President Ibrahim made a decision that would generate headlines around the world. During a nationally televised press conference, he stood before the cameras with Divine at his side. "My fellow citizens," he began, "recent events have taught me valuable lessons about leadership and trust. I have realized that wisdom doesn't always come from those with the most experience or the highest degrees. Sometimes it comes from those who see the world with fresh eyes and honest hearts." He placed his hand on Divine's shoulder. "This young woman, Divine Traoré, came into my life by chance. She had lost everything: her parents, her home, her security, but she never lost her courage or her integrity. When she noticed something that didn't seem right, she had the bravery to speak up. Because of her question, we uncovered a theft that would have cost our nation hundreds of millions of francs." The room buzzed with whispered conversations as journalists exchanged glances. "Therefore," Ibrahim continued, "I am today appointing Divine Traoré as my special advisor on governmental integrity. She will attend all significant meetings, review important documents, and provide counsel on matters of national importance." Reporter immediately raised her hand. "Mr. President, with respect, this child cannot possibly understand the complexities of government. Isn't this just a publicity stunt?" Ibrahim's expression remained calm but firm. "Divine may be young, but she possesses something that many adults have lost: the ability to ask simple, direct questions. She doesn't accept that things must be done a certain way simply because that's how they've always been done. In my experience, the most complex problems often have surprisingly simple solutions, if we're brave enough to look at them honestly." Divine stepped closer to the microphone, her voice clear and steady despite her obvious nervousness. "I know I'm just a child," she said, "but I've learned that age doesn't determine whether someone is right or wrong. If I can help make life better for other children who don't have parents, then I want to try." The room fell silent. Even the most cynical journalists were moved by her sincerity. From that day forward, Divine's presence in high-level meetings became routine. Ministers who had grown comfortable with vague explanations and bureaucratic doublespeak found themselves facing pointed questions from a 9-year-old who had no patience for evasion or dishonesty. During a meeting about education funding, she asked why new schools weren't being built in rural areas where children had to walk hours to attend classes. During a discussion about health care, she wondered why expensive medicines were being purchased from overseas when local companies could produce them for a fraction of the cost. During an infrastructure session, she questioned why road construction Contracts always seemed to go to the same companies, regardless of their past performance. Her questions weren't just innocent curiosity. They revealed systematic flaws in how the government operated. Officials who had previously rubber-stamped decisions found themselves actually researching issues and providing detailed justifications for their recommendations. Not everyone was pleased with Divine's influence. In the shadows of the palace, in the private clubs where powerful men gathered to discuss business, and in the offices of those whose corrupt practices had been disrupted, resentment began to build. "This is ridiculous," muttered Dr. Sankara, the former director of public works who had been dismissed after Divine questioned irregularities in his department's contracts. "A child making decisions about national policy? It's an embarrassment." "More than embarrassing," agreed Mamadou Ouattara, a wealthy businessman whose construction company had been excluded from government contracts after failing to meet the new transparency requirements Divine had inspired. "It's dangerous. She's destroying the relationships that make business possible." These men began to meet regularly, united by their shared frustration with the new order. They convinced themselves that they were patriots fighting against the diminishment of Burkina Faso's dignity on the international stage. In reality, they were simply men who had grown rich through corrupt practices and were angry that their system had been disrupted. Their first attempt at removing Divine from her position was subtle. They spread rumors through their networks, questioning her legitimacy and suggesting that President Ibrahim had been manipulated by forces beyond his control. "Have you noticed how she never laughs?" one would whisper to another. "What kind of child doesn't laugh or play? It's not natural." "I heard she speaks to spirits in the cemetery," another would add. "Maybe she's channeling something dark." These whispers reached the ears of palace staff, some of whom began to view Divine with suspicion. A few even approached President Ibrahim with their concerns. "Sir," ventured Mrs. Dow, the deputy protocol chief, "some staff members are saying that the girl might be unusual. They think she might have supernatural influences." Ibrahim looked at her with disappointment. "Mrs. Dow, Divine is a child who has experienced tremendous loss and trauma. If she seems mature beyond her years, it's because circumstances forced her to grow up too quickly. If she's serious, it's because she's learned that life can be fragile and precious. There's nothing supernatural about intelligence and courage." But the whispers continued, and they began to reach beyond the palace walls. The enemies of progress decided that subtle approaches weren't working fast enough. If rumors and whispers couldn't remove Divine from her position, more direct action would be necessary. The plan was conceived during a clandestine meeting in a private dining room at the Grand Hotel. 6 men sat around the table, their faces illuminated by candlelight as they discussed what they called the child problem. "She's too well protected during the day," observed Colonel Zungrana, a former military officer who had been forced into early retirement after Divine exposed his involvement in fraudulent arms purchases. "But in the evenings she often walks alone in the palace gardens." "We can't harm a child directly," protested one of the group. "The international condemnation would be massive." "It doesn't have to look intentional," Zungrana replied coldly. "Accidents happen. Children are vulnerable." They settled on a plan that was as cruel as it was cowardly. They would arrange for Divine to have an accident during one of her evening walks, perhaps a fall from a balcony or a drowning in the palace fountain. With her gone, they believed, President Ibrahim would return to the old ways of doing business. But Divine had learned, during her years of surviving on the streets, to be constantly aware of her surroundings. On the evening they had chosen for their attack, she noticed immediately that something was wrong. The gardens, which usually bustled, with maintenance staff at this hour, were strangely quiet. The guards who normally patrolled the area were nowhere to be seen. As she walked toward her favorite reading spot beneath an old mango tree, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, she saw a figure in maintenance overalls approaching. But this wasn't one of the regular gardeners. This man was too large, too deliberate in his movements, and there was something in his hand that gleamed in the moonlight. Divine ran. She sprinted through the gardens with the speed of a child whose life had often depended on quick escapes. Behind her, she could hear the man cursing and crashing through the flower beds as he gave chase. She reached the main palace building and began screaming for help. "Guards, help me! Someone's trying to hurt me!" The response was immediate. Security. Personnel poured from the building, their weapons drawn. The would-be attacker realized his situation was hopeless and tried to flee, but was tackled and subdued before he could escape. Under interrogation, the truth emerged. The man was not a palace employee, but a hired criminal who had been paid to remove the obstacle that Divine represented. When pressed for names, he initially refused to cooperate, but the prospect of facing terrorism charges alone convinced him to provide details about his employers. The arrests that followed sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso's political and business establishment. Colonel Zungrana, Dr. Sankara, Mamadou Ouattara, and 3 others were charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The scandal dominated headlines for weeks, and public sympathy for Divine reached unprecedented levels. President Ibrahim held another press conference, this time with Divine's security detail visibly increased. "Those who would harm a child to protect their corrupt interests have revealed their true nature," he declared. "Divine's courage in exposing wrongdoing has made enemies of those who profit from injustice. This only proves how necessary her work has become." Divine, standing beside him with remarkable composure for someone who had just survived an assassination attempt, spoke directly to the cameras. "I'm not afraid of people who want to hurt me for telling the truth. My parents taught me that doing what's right is more important than doing what's safe." Of all the attacks Divine faced, none wounded President Ibrahim more deeply than the one that came from someone he had once considered a brother. Emmanuel Sawadogo had grown up in the same neighborhood as Ibrahim, played football in the same dusty fields, and shared dreams of making their country better. When Ibrahim became president, Emmanuel had been one of his most enthusiastic supporters, often visiting the palace to offer advice and reminisce about their childhood. But Emmanuel's visits had become less frequent since Divine's arrival, and when he did come, his demeanor had changed. He seemed uncomfortable with the new protocols Divine had inspired, frustrated by the increased scrutiny that made casual favors impossible, and resentful of the time Ibrahim devoted to his young advisor. On a particularly hot afternoon in March, Emmanuel requested a private meeting with the president. He entered the office with none of his usual warmth, his face set in grim lines. "Ibrahim," he said without preamble, "we need to talk about that girl." President Ibrahim looked up from the budget documents he was reviewing with Divine. "Hello to you too, Emmanuel. Divine, would you mind giving us some privacy?" Divine gathered her papers and moved to leave, but Emmanuel's next words stopped her cold. "No, let her stay," he said harshly. "She should hear this too. This charade has gone on long enough." Ibrahim's expression hardened. "What charade?" "This." Emmanuel gestured wildly at the office, at Divine, at the careful organization that had transformed the way the presidency operated. "You've turned the highest office in our nation into a playground for a child. Do you realize how we look to the world? How can other presidents take you seriously when you're getting advice from a little girl? Divine's advice has saved our country millions of francs and exposed corruption that was undermining our development," Ibrahim replied calmly. "I would think you'd appreciate that." "She's a child," Emmanuel shouted. "She should be playing with dolls, not sitting in on meetings about national security. This isn't normal, Ibrahim. Can't you see what's happened to you?" Divine remained silent, but her hands trembled slightly as she listened to this man she had always treated with respect attack everything she had worked for. "Emmanuel," Ibrahim said slowly, "you're my oldest friend, but you're out of line. Divine has earned her place here through intelligence, integrity, and courage. What exactly is your objection to her?" Emmanuel's composure cracked completely. "My objection? My objection is that I can't even get a meeting with you anymore unless I go through your secretary. My objection is that every business opportunity I bring to you gets questioned by a 9-year-old who doesn't understand how the real world works. My objection is that you treat this orphan girl like she's your daughter while you ignore the friends who supported you when you had nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Ibrahim stared at his childhood friend, seeing clearly for the first time the jealousy and greed that had been hidden beneath years of friendship. Divine looked between the two men, understanding with painful clarity the dynamics that had brought them to this moment. "I see," Ibrahim said finally. "So this isn't about Divine's age or qualifications. This is about your disappointment that I won't approve contracts for your companies without proper oversight. This is about your anger that friendship doesn't guarantee special treatment anymore." Emmanuel's face flushed red. "You've changed, Ibrahim. That girl has poisoned your mind against your real friends. She's made you paranoid and suspicious. You need help, spiritual help. Let me take you to see a marabout who can free you from whatever hold she has over you." Divine had heard enough. Despite her youth, she had developed a keen understanding of human nature through her experiences on the streets and in the palace. She stood up slowly and looked directly at Emmanuel. "Mr. Emmanuel," she said quietly, "you're angry because Papa won't help you become rich through dishonest means. But that anger is making you say things that aren't true and aren't fair. I never asked to come here. I never asked for any of this. I just want to help make things better for people who don't have what I have now." Emmanuel turned on her with fury. "You don't belong here. You should be grateful we even let you speak." "That's enough." Ibrahim stood up, his voice carrying the full weight of presidential authority. "Emmanuel, you will not speak to her that way in my presence. You will not speak to her that way anywhere." "So you choose her over me?" Emmanuel asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "Over 20 years of friendship?" "I choose right over wrong," Ibrahim replied. "I choose honesty over corruption. I choose the future over the past. If those choices mean I lose your friendship, then it was never really friendship to begin with." Emmanuel stood in the doorway for a moment, his face a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "You'll regret this, Ibrahim. When she betrays you, and she will, remember that your real friends tried to warn you." He stormed out, leaving behind a relationship that had once meant everything to both men. That evening, Emmanuel sat in a bar in downtown Ouagadougou, drowning his sorrows and his rage in local beer. It was there that Colonel Zungrana found him, recognizing in Emmanuel's anger a potential ally for more drastic action. "He chose her over you," Zungrana said, sliding into the seat across from Emmanuel. "After everything you've done for him, all the support you gave him when he was nobody." Emmanuel looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "She's destroyed everything. Our friendship, my businesses, everything. Then maybe it's time she faced some consequences," Zungrana suggested quietly. "Maybe it's time they both did." The plot that emerged from their collaboration was more ambitious and more dangerous than anything attempted before. If they couldn't remove Divine through legitimate means or simple violence, they would remove both her and the president who protected her. A coup, they reasoned, would restore the natural order and eliminate both obstacles to their prosperity. But coups require careful planning, reliable allies, and absolute secrecy. Unfortunately for them, Emmanuel's drunken boasting and Zungrana's indiscreet recruiting had attracted the attention of the intelligence services, who had been monitoring known dissidents since the previous attack on Divine. The plot unraveled when one of the conspirators, facing financial ruin due to his exclusion from government contracts, attempted to recruit a junior military officer who immediately reported the approach to his superiors. Within 48 hours, Emmanuel and Zungrana were arrested along with 6 other conspirators. The evidence against them was overwhelming: recorded conversations, financial transfers, and detailed plans that left no doubt about their intentions. When President Ibrahim was briefed on the full scope of the plot, he sat in silence for several minutes. Divine, who had been present for the briefing, reached over and took his hand. "I'm sorry about your friend, Papa," she said softly. Ibrahim squeezed her hand. "He stopped being my friend the moment he chose greed over loyalty, corruption over country. You have nothing to apologize for." The trial that followed was a sensation. Emmanuel's transformation from presidential confidant to would-be coup leader became a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power and privilege. His testimony revealed the extent of the network that had opposed Divine's influence, and his conviction sent a clear message that no one, regardless of their past relationship with the president, was above the law. In the aftermath of the coup attempt, something remarkable happened. The people of Burkina Faso, who had initially been skeptical or curious about their president's young advisor, began to see her as a symbol of hope and renewal. Letters poured into the presidential palace from across the country, from school children who admired her courage, from parents who wished their own children could have her opportunities, from grandmothers who saw in her the wisdom of their ancestors. "Dear Divine," wrote a 12-year-old girl from Bobo Dioulasso, "you give me hope that children's voices matter. Because of you, I'm not afraid to ask questions in school anymore." "Little sister," wrote a market woman from Koudougou, "you have shown us that truth is more powerful than money. My children know your story, and they understand that honesty is the most valuable thing they can possess." Schools across the country began teaching Divine's questions, critical thinking exercises that encouraged students to examine problems from multiple angles and ask probing questions about proposed solutions. Universities invited her to speak at graduation ceremonies, where she would remind new graduates that their education came with the responsibility to serve their communities honestly. International organizations took notice as well. UNICEF appointed her as a youth ambassador for children's rights, and the African Union invited her to address their annual summit on good governance. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The cemetery where her parents were buried had become a place of pilgrimage for families seeking hope after loss. People would bring their children to see the grave where Divine had lived, to understand that even the most desperate circumstances could not defeat a determined spirit. As Divine grew older and more experienced in her role, she began to understand that her position carried responsibilities beyond simply identifying corruption and asking difficult questions. She needed to help build systems that would continue to function long after she was gone. Working with international development experts and local civil society organizations, Divine helped establish the Transparency Academy, a training program that taught government officials, journalists, and citizens how to identify and report corrupt practices. The curriculum, developed with input from Divine's real-world experiences, became a model that was adopted by governments across West Africa. "The most important lesson I've learned," Divine told a gathering of African youth leaders, "is that fighting corruption isn't about being suspicious of everyone. It's about creating systems where honesty is easier than dishonesty, where transparency is the default, and where people are rewarded for doing the right thing." She also established the Divine Cabaret Foundation for Orphan Children, using donations from supporters around the world to create safe houses, educational programs, and support networks for children who had lost their parents. Each facility included a library, computer center, and workshops where children could learn practical skills. "Every child deserves a chance to discover their potential," she explained during the Foundation's first annual report. "My story could have ended in that cemetery, but someone gave me an opportunity to contribute something positive to the world. Now it's my responsibility to create those same opportunities for others." By the time Divine turned 12, her influence had extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The Ouagadougou model of youth involvement in governance became a subject of study in political science departments worldwide. Delegations from other African countries visited Burkina Faso to observe how a child's perspective had transformed an entire system of government. President Ibrahim, now in his second term and consistently rated as one of Africa's most effective leaders, never tired of crediting Divine with saving his presidency and his country. She didn't just expose corruption, he would tell international audiences. She reminded us that leadership means serving others, not ourselves. The transformation was measurable in concrete terms. Burkina Faso's ranking on international corruption indices had improved dramatically. Foreign investment had increased as businesses gained confidence in the country's regulatory environment. Most importantly, government services had improved significantly. Schools were being built on schedule, hospitals were properly equipped, and infrastructure projects were completed within budget. Divine's approach had also influenced how President Ibrahim selected his cabinet and senior staff. Every candidate now underwent what became known as the Divine Test, a series of questions designed to assess their commitment to transparency, their understanding of public service, and their ability to explain complex issues in simple terms. If you can't explain your policy to a 12-year-old, Divine would often say, maybe you don't understand it well enough yourself. As Divine entered her teenage years, she faced new challenges. Critics argued that she had been effective as a child precisely because of her innocence, but questioned whether she could maintain her influence as she matured. Some suggested that her role should be transitional, preparing the way for more traditional governance structures. Divine herself had begun to think about these questions. She knew that her unique position couldn't last forever, and she wanted to ensure that the changes she had helped implement would survive her eventual departure from government service. I never intended to be a government official for my entire life, she said during a candid interview on her 13th birthday. My goal has always been to help create a system where my role wouldn't be necessary, where transparency and accountability are so deeply embedded in how we do business that no one person needs to be the guardian of honesty. Working with constitutional law experts, Divine helped draft legislation that would institutionalize many of the reforms she had championed. The Good Governance Act required all government contracts above a certain value to undergo public review, established independent oversight committees for major projects, and created whistleblower protections for citizens who reported corruption. She also established a youth parliament where young people from across the country could propose legislation, debate policy issues, and train for future leadership roles. Democracy works best when everyone has a voice, she explained, but we need to teach people how to use their voices effectively. Despite her public responsibilities, Divine never forgot her origins or the parents who had shaped her values. She visited their graves every week, often bringing flowers and spending quiet moments sharing her experiences and seeking guidance from their memory. Sometimes I wonder what they would think of all this, she confided to President Ibrahim during one of their regular evening talks. I was supposed to be just their little girl, not someone making speeches to world leaders. They would be proud, Ibrahim replied. Not because of the fame or recognition, but because you've used every opportunity to help others. That's what good parents hope for, that their children will make the world a little better. Divine had also developed close friendships with other children at the palace, including the president's own grandchildren who visited frequently. These relationships helped her maintain perspective and remember the importance of play, laughter, and the simple joys of childhood. Mrs. Kanazoe, who had become like a grandmother to Divine, often marveled at how the girl had balanced her extraordinary responsibilities with normal adolescent development. She still gets excited about new books, the housekeeper would tell visitors. She still loves ice cream and gets grumpy when she's tired. The remarkable thing about Divine isn't that she's different from other children. It's that she's managed to stay true to herself while taking on such enormous responsibilities. Not every initiative Divine championed was successful. A program to digitize government records faced technical difficulties and budget overruns. An anti-corruption campaign, in the education sector, encountered resistance from teachers who felt unfairly targeted. Some of her policy recommendations proved impractical when tested in real-world conditions. These failures were learning experiences that taught Devine valuable lessons about the complexity of governance and the importance of humility. I used to think that if something was obviously right, it should be easy to implement, she reflected after a particularly challenging setback. But I've learned that even good ideas need careful planning, adequate resources, and the support of people who will be affected by the changes. Critics seized on these failures as evidence that Devine's influence had been overvalued. But President Ibrahim stood by her consistently. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said during a press conference addressing the criticism. "The difference is that Devine learns from her mistakes and uses them to improve her next approach. That's exactly the kind of leadership our country needs." Devine's response to criticism became legendary. Rather than becoming defensive or withdrawing from public view, she embraced accountability with the same rigor she applied to others. She published detailed reports analyzing failed initiatives, accepting responsibility for poor decisions while outlining lessons learned and improved approaches for the future. "If I expect government officials to admit their mistakes and learn from them," she said, "I have to hold myself to the same standard." As Devine approached her 15th birthday, she began work on what she called her legacy project, a comprehensive reform of Burkina Faso's education system that would ensure future generations of citizens would be equipped with the critical thinking skills necessary to maintain democratic accountability. Working with educators, parents, and students across the country, Devine helped develop a new curriculum that emphasized civic engagement, media literacy, and ethical reasoning alongside traditional academic subjects. The program, piloted in 50 schools across different regions, showed promising results in standardized assessments and student engagement metrics. Education isn't just about preparing people for jobs, Devine explained to a gathering of education ministers from across Africa. It's about preparing them for citizenship, teaching them to ask good questions, evaluate evidence, and participate meaningfully in democratic processes. The curriculum included modules specifically designed around Devine's experiences: case studies in corruption detection, exercises in policy analysis, and simulations where students could practice the art of constructive criticism. But it also emphasized that effective citizenship required more than just the ability to identify problems. "Anyone can complain about what's wrong," Devine would tell student groups. "The real challenge is developing practical solutions and building the coalitions necessary to implement them." Devine's influence began to extend beyond Burkina Faso's borders in ways that surprised even her supporters. Other African countries started implementing their own versions of youth advisory councils, inspired by her example. International development organizations began incorporating youth perspective audits into their program design processes. A documentary about Devine's life, produced by a team of international filmmakers, won awards at film festivals worldwide and sparked conversations about children's rights, democratic governance, and the potential for transformative leadership to emerge from unexpected sources. Devine's story resonates because it reminds us that positive change is possible, wrote one film critic. In a world often dominated by cynicism about politics and governance, she represents hope grounded in practical action. The attention wasn't always comfortable for Devine, who had never sought celebrity, but understood that her platform gave her opportunities to advocate for causes she cared about. She used speaking engagements and media interviews to highlight the work of other young activists, the ongoing challenges facing orphaned children, and the importance of maintaining democratic institutions. "I'm grateful for the attention my story has received," she said during a UN Youth Assembly address. "But I hope people remember that I'm just one example of what's possible when young people are given opportunities to contribute. There are thousands of children around the world with ideas and energy that could help solve our biggest challenges, if we're willing to listen to them." As Divine entered her final year as special advisor, she and President Ibrahim began planning for her transition to other roles. Both agreed that her direct involvement in daily government operations should evolve as she pursued higher education and explored other ways to serve her country. The process was handled carefully with extensive consultation among government officials, civil society groups, and international partners who had worked with Divine over the years. The consensus was that while Divine's specific role might change, the reforms and institutions she had helped establish needed to be preserved and strengthened. The test of any reform isn't whether it works while its champion is in place. Divine observed during a farewell ceremony at the presidential palace. It's whether it continues to work after that person moves on to other challenges. A permanent Office of Governmental Integrity was established to continue many of the oversight functions Divine had performed, staffed by trained professionals, and governed by the legal frameworks she had helped develop. The office would be independent of direct presidential control, reporting to Parliament and the public through regular transparency reports. Divine was accepted to study international relations at the University of Oxford, with plans to return to Burkina Faso to work in whatever capacity would be most useful to her country's continued development. But she made it clear that her departure from government service wasn't a departure from public service. "I'll always be available to help if I'm needed," she promised during her final official speech as special advisor. "This country gave me everything when I had nothing, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to repay that debt." President Ibrahim's final term ended 2 years after Divine left for university, and he stepped down as one of Africa's most respected leaders. The peaceful transition of power, conducted under the oversight of the reformed institutions Divine had helped create, was praised by international observers as a model for democratic governance. Divine graduated from Oxford with honors and returned to Burkina Faso to establish a think tank focused on youth development and democratic innovation. The Center for Citizen Engagement became a hub for training programs, policy research, and advocacy work that influenced government policy across West Africa. She never married, dedicating her life instead to the children and communities that had shaped her understanding of service and sacrifice. The Divine Traoré Foundation grew into one of Africa's largest child welfare organizations, operating in 12 countries and serving thousands of orphaned and vulnerable children each year. The 10th anniversary of her appointment as special advisor, Divine returned to the cemetery where President Ibrahim had first found her. The simple grave where her parents were buried had been transformed into a memorial garden, maintained by the government and visited by thousands of people each year who came to pay respects to the couple whose daughter had changed a nation. As she knelt beside their graves, Divine whispered words of gratitude for the lessons they had taught her and the values they had instilled. The little girl who had once cleaned their tombstone with a torn cloth had become a woman whose influence extended around the world, but she had never forgotten the source of her strength. "Thank you for teaching me to ask questions," she said, softly. "Thank you for showing me that love is stronger than loss, that truth is more powerful than fear, and that even the smallest person can make a difference if they have the courage to try." The sun was setting over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. In schools across the country, children were learning to think critically about the world around them. In government offices, officials were implementing policies with unprecedented transparency. In communities throughout Burkina Faso and beyond, young people were organizing to address local challenges with the confidence that their voices mattered. Divine's story had become more than just the tale of one remarkable child. It had become a testament to the transformative power of courage, integrity, and the unwavering belief that a better world is always possible for those brave enough to work for it. As she walked away from the cemetery that evening, Divine smiled at the thought of all the young people who would carry forward the work she had begun. Her parents' dream that she should take care of her future had evolved into something far greater, a legacy that would inspire generations to come to ask better questions, demand higher standards, and never accept that things must remain as they are simply because that's how they've always been. The little girl from the graveyard had indeed taken care of her future, and in doing so had helped secure a brighter future for countless others. Her story was ending, but the movement she had sparked would continue, carried forward by young voices asking the same simple, powerful questions that had once changed a nation. Why? And what if there's a better way? This expanded story of Divine and President Ibrahim Traoré illustrates the profound impact that courage, integrity, and the willingness to question established systems can have on society. While fictional, it reflects real struggles against corruption and the universal human capacity for positive change, regardless of age or circumstance. Divine's journey from orphaned child to transformative leader reminds us that wisdom can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that the voices of the young and marginalized often carry the seeds of the solutions our world most desperately needs.